In the middle of the 19th century, Europe was entering a new age of power and expansion. Nations competed for land, resources, and influence across the globe. Empires were symbols of prestige, strength, and wealth. Countries such as Britain, France, and Spain controlled vast territories overseas. Their flags flew across continents, and their ships traveled the world carrying goods, soldiers, and administrators. But in the small European country of Belgium, one man looked at this imperial competition with growing frustration. That man was Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold was born in the year 1835 in the city of Brussels. He was the son of Leopold I of Belgium, the founding monarch of the young Belgian nation. Belgium itself was a relatively new country, having gained independence only a few years earlier. It was small compared to the great European powers, and it had no overseas colonies. To many Belgians, this was not a major concern. Their country was prosperous, stable, and strategically located in Europe. But to Leopold, it was a source of deep dissatisfaction. From a young age, Leopold developed an intense fascination with empire. He studied maps of distant lands and read about the wealth flowing from colonies into European capitals. He observed how countries like Britain and France used their overseas territories to strengthen their economies and expand their political influence. Colonies provided raw materials such as rubber, ivory, gold, and spices. These resources could be sold for enormous profit in European markets. For Leopold, it became increasingly clear that colonies were not just distant lands. They were engines of wealth and power. As Leopold grew older, his ambition became more visible. When he traveled across Europe and visited other nations, he carefully observed how imperial systems worked. He spoke with explorers, traders, and diplomats who had experience in Africa and Asia. These conversations only strengthened his belief that Belgium was missing a great opportunity. In his view, Belgium should not remain a small European state with no global presence. It should join the ranks of the great imperial powers. In 1865, Leopold II became king after the death of his father. Now he had the authority to pursue his ambitions. Yet he quickly encountered a major obstacle. The Belgian government had little interest in acquiring colonies. Many politicians believed that overseas territories were expensive and difficult to manage. Maintaining a colonial administration required ships, soldiers, and large financial investments. Belgium's leaders preferred to focus on domestic development and trade within Europe. Leopold found this attitude frustrating. He believed that Belgium's future depended on expansion beyond Europe. But if the Belgian government would not support colonial projects, he would need to find another way. Over time, Leopold began to imagine a strategy that was both bold and unusual. Instead of creating a colony for Belgium, he would attempt to acquire a colony for himself. At the time, large parts of Africa remained unknown to Europeans. Explorers had traveled along the coasts and major rivers, but much of the continent's interior was still mysterious to the outside world. European maps often contained large blank areas labeled simply as unknown territory. To ambitious rulers and businessmen, these blank spaces represented opportunity. Leopold became particularly interested in Central Africa. The region surrounding the Great Congo River was vast, rich in natural resources, and largely unclaimed by European powers at the time. Reports from explorers suggested that the area contained enormous wealth in ivory and other valuable materials. Leopold believed that if he could establish control there, he could create one of the most profitable territories in the world. But claiming land in Africa required international recognition. European powers were suspicious of each other's ambitions, and conflicts could arise if multiple countries attempted to seize the same territory. Leopold needed a strategy that would convince other nations to support his plans rather than oppose them. To achieve this, he began presenting himself as a humanitarian and a champion of civilization. In public speeches and diplomatic meetings, Leopold spoke about bringing progress and development to Africa. He claimed that European involvement would help end the slave trade and introduce modern education, medicine, and commerce to African societies. These statements were carefully designed to appeal to the moral values of European audiences. Behind the scenes, however, Leopold's motivations were far less noble. His private correspondence revealed that he was primarily interested in profit and power. The resources of Central Africa represented enormous financial potential, and Leopold wanted to control them. By presenting his ambitions as a humanitarian mission, he hoped to avoid political opposition while quietly securing authority over the region. In 1876, Leopold organized an international meeting in Brussels. The event gathered explorers, geographers, and philanthropists from across Europe. Officially, the purpose of the meeting was to discuss scientific exploration and humanitarian cooperation in Africa. Leopold announced the creation of an organization known as the International African Association. According to its public mission, the association would support research, build trading posts, and promote the well-being of African communities. Many attendees believed they were participating in a genuine effort to advance knowledge and humanitarian work. Few realized that the organization was actually part of Leopold's larger strategy to establish control over Central Africa. By creating an international association rather than a Belgian government project, Leopold was able to present his plans as neutral and philanthropic. The next step in Leopold's plan involved exploration. To establish authority over the Congo region, he needed someone capable of navigating its vast rivers and negotiating with local leaders. For this task, he turned to a famous explorer named Henry Morton Stanley. Stanley had already gained international fame for his expeditions in Africa. His journeys along the Congo River had revealed important information about the region's geography and trade routes. Leopold saw Stanley as the perfect person to help turn his colonial ambitions into reality. In 1879, Stanley began working secretly for Leopold. His mission was to travel through the Congo Basin, establish trading stations, and sign agreements with local chiefs. These agreements often involved misunderstandings or deception. Many African leaders believed they were entering simple trade partnerships, not surrendering their land and sovereignty to a distant European king. Over several years, Stanley built a network of stations and transport routes along the Congo River. These outposts gradually extended Leopold's influence deeper into the region. While European audiences continued hearing about humanitarian missions and scientific exploration, the foundations of a vast colonial system were quietly taking shape. By the early 1880s, Leopold had achieved something extraordinary. Through diplomacy, exploration, and careful public relations, he had positioned himself to claim control over one of the largest territories in Africa. Yet the final step still remained. He needed international recognition that would legitimize his authority and prevent other European powers from challenging his claim. The opportunity to secure that recognition would soon arrive at one of the most famous diplomatic meetings in history. European leaders were preparing to gather in the German capital to discuss the future of Africa. This meeting would determine how the continent would be divided among colonial powers. For Leopold, it was the moment he had been waiting for. And the decisions made there would change the fate of millions of people living in the heart of Africa. The Scramble for Africa. By the late 19th century, Africa had become the focus of an intense and dangerous competition among European powers. Nations that had once limited their presence to coastal trading posts were now racing to control the interior of the continent. Historians would later call this period the Scramble for Africa, a time when European empires divided almost the entire continent among themselves within just a few decades. For centuries, much of Africa had remained politically and culturally independent from Europe. African kingdoms, empires, and communities governed their own territories, conducted trade, and maintained complex social systems. But during the 19th century, several powerful forces began to change the relationship between Europe and Africa. The first major factor was industrialization. Across Europe, factories were expanding rapidly. These factories required enormous amounts of raw materials to keep production moving. Rubber, palm oil, cotton, copper, and other natural resources were suddenly in high demand. European nations began searching for new territories where these materials could be obtained cheaply and in large quantities. At the same time, European populations were growing, cities were expanding, and governments were looking for new markets where they could sell manufactured goods. Colonies offered both resources and customers. This economic motivation became one of the strongest driving forces behind European expansion. Political rivalry also played an important role. During the 19th century, European nations were constantly competing for power and prestige. Having a large empire became a symbol of national strength. When one country gained a new colony, others felt pressure to follow. No nation wanted to appear weak or fall behind its rivals. Countries such as Britain and France had already built enormous empires across Asia and the Americas. Their ships sailed across oceans, connecting distant lands to their capitals. Meanwhile, newer powers like Germany and Italy were beginning to look for colonial territories of their own. Africa, with its vast lands and resources, became the primary target. Technological advances made this expansion easier than ever before. Improved steamships allowed Europeans to travel deeper into African rivers. New medicines, particularly quinine, helped protect explorers and soldiers from malaria, a disease that had previously limited European presence in tropical regions. Modern weapons also gave European armies a powerful advantage in conflicts with local forces. As exploration increased, maps of Africa began to fill in. Rivers, mountain ranges, and trade routes that had once been mysterious were now being documented by explorers. These discoveries sparked even greater interest in the continent. European leaders realized that whoever claimed territory first would control its wealth. Among those watching this unfolding race was Leopold II of Belgium. Unlike the leaders of large empires, Leopold ruled a small European nation. Belgium had no colonial territories and very little influence outside Europe. But Leopold believed that this could change. While other European powers competed openly for colonies, Leopold pursued a quieter strategy. Instead of announcing a national expansion, he presented himself as a humanitarian leader interested in exploration and development. Through organizations such as the International African Association, he continued promoting the idea that his activities in Africa were motivated by science and philanthropy. Behind this carefully constructed image, Leopold was steadily expanding his influence in Central Africa. The explorer Henry Morton Stanley played a crucial role in this effort. Working under Leopold's direction, Stanley traveled through the Congo Basin, establishing trading stations and negotiating agreements with local chiefs. These agreements were often written in European languages that African leaders could not read. In many cases, chiefs believed they were allowing Europeans to establish trading posts or cooperative relationships. They did not realize that the documents they were signing were being interpreted in Europe as transfers of sovereignty and ownership. Through these treaties, Leopold claimed that vast areas of land had been voluntarily placed under his authority. By the early 1880s, hundreds of such agreements had been collected. On paper, they appeared to give Leopold control over territory larger than many European countries combined. The heart of this territory was the region surrounding the great Congo River. The river stretched thousands of kilometers through the dense forests of Central Africa, providing a natural transportation route deep into the continent. Control of this river meant access to enormous natural wealth hidden within the surrounding lands. Ivory was one of the most valuable resources found there. At the time, ivory was used in Europe and America to manufacture luxury items such as piano keys, billiard balls, jewelry, and decorative carvings. Demand was extremely high, and traders were willing to pay large sums for ivory obtained from African elephants. But ivory was only the beginning. Another resource would soon transform the global economy: rubber. The late 19th century saw the rise of new industries that depended on rubber products. Bicycles were becoming popular across Europe. Electrical cables required rubber insulation. Later, the invention of automobiles would increase demand even further. The forests of Central Africa contained vast numbers of wild rubber vines. If harvested efficiently, they could produce enormous profits. Leopold understood this potential earlier than most. By controlling the Congo region, he believed he could dominate the global rubber trade. While Leopold continued expanding his network of trading stations, the competition among European powers was intensifying. Explorers and military expeditions from different nations were moving across Africa, each attempting to secure territory for their governments. Conflicts between rival claims were becoming more likely. European leaders realized that without clear agreements, colonial competition could lead to war. To prevent this, diplomatic negotiations became necessary. A major international meeting was proposed to establish rules for colonial expansion in Africa. The meeting would take place in the German capital of Berlin. Organized by the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, the conference would bring together representatives from the most powerful nations in Europe. The purpose of the gathering was to create an official framework for dividing African territories among European powers. Ironically, no African leaders were invited to participate. Decisions about the future of the continent would be made entirely by foreign governments. For Leopold, this conference represented both a risk and an opportunity. If other European powers challenged his claims in Central Africa, his entire plan could collapse. But if he succeeded in convincing them to recognize his authority, he would gain something extraordinary. He would become the ruler of a territory millions of times larger than his own country. And unlike other colonial rulers, he would not be governing on behalf of a nation. He would control it personally. The decisions made at the upcoming conference would determine whether Leopold's dream became reality. European diplomats would gather around negotiation tables, studying maps and drawing borders that would reshape Africa forever. What they agreed upon would soon give Leopold control over one of the largest and richest regions of the continent. But the consequences for the people living there would be devastating. The birth of the Congo Free State. In November 1884, representatives of the world's most powerful nations gathered in the city of Berlin for a diplomatic meeting that would change the future of Africa forever. The event became known as the Berlin Conference. Its official purpose was to establish rules for European expansion in Africa and prevent conflicts between rival colonial powers. But the conference had one extraordinary feature. Not a single African leader was invited. Decisions about the fate of millions of African people were made entirely by European diplomats sitting around conference tables. They examined maps, negotiated territorial claims, and created agreements that would divide the continent among their nations. Among the participants were representatives from Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Italy, Spain, and several other European countries. Also present were diplomats representing the ambitions of one particular individual, Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold did not attend the conference personally, but his influence was strongly felt. For years he had carefully prepared for this moment. Through diplomatic negotiations and public campaigns, he had worked to convince European leaders that his activities in Central Africa were humanitarian rather than imperial. He presented himself as a man committed to ending the slave trade and bringing civilization, Christianity, and free commerce to the African interior. His organizations claimed they were building schools, hospitals, and trading stations that would benefit local communities. To many European leaders, these claims sounded admirable. They also saw Leopold as a convenient solution to a potential problem. The vast region around the Congo River was still largely unclaimed by any major European nation. If a powerful country like Britain or France took control, it could upset the balance of power in Africa. Allowing Leopold to manage the region as a neutral administrator seemed like a reasonable compromise. Since Belgium was a small country, it posed little threat to the ambitions of larger empires. Supporting Leopold's project could help maintain peace among competing colonial powers. Leopold's representatives skillfully reinforced this narrative. They argued that the territory under Leopold's control would remain open to trade from all nations. No country would be excluded from commercial opportunities in the Congo Basin. This promise reassured many governments that they would not lose economic access to the region. Gradually, the diplomats at the conference began to accept Leopold's proposal. In February 1885, the negotiations concluded with a historic decision. European powers officially recognized a new political entity in Central Africa known as the Congo Free State. At first glance, the name sounded promising. The term Free State suggested freedom, cooperation, and international administration. But in reality, the Congo Free State was something unprecedented in modern history. It was not a colony belonging to Belgium. It was not governed by an international organization. It was the personal property of one man, King Leopold II. The territory was enormous. Covering more than 2 million square kilometers, the Congo Free State was about 75 times larger than Belgium itself. Millions of people lived within its borders, belonging to hundreds of different ethnic groups and communities. Leopold now possessed direct authority over this vast land and its inhabitants. He could create laws, appoint officials, control trade, and manage resources as he wished. Essentially, he had become the ruler of a private empire in the heart of Africa. At first, many Europeans celebrated this development. Newspapers described Leopold as a visionary leader bringing progress to a remote and undeveloped region. Some even praised him as a humanitarian who was working to eliminate slavery and introduce modern civilization to Central Africa. Leopold carefully encouraged this positive image. He continued funding expeditions, building stations, and promoting reports that highlighted infrastructure development in the Congo. Railways were planned, administrative centers were established, and missionaries were invited to spread Christianity. However, beneath this image of progress, a very different system was beginning to emerge. Leopold's primary goal had always been profit. The Congo Free State was not designed to function like a traditional colony focused on settlement or development. Instead, it was structured as an enormous resource extraction machine. The first major industry Leopold expanded was ivory collection. Traders working under his administration began organizing expeditions to hunt elephants and gather tusks from across the region. Ivory shipments were transported along the Congo River to the Atlantic coast, where they were loaded onto ships bound for Europe. The profits were substantial, but something even more valuable soon captured Leopold's attention: rubber. During the late 19th century, the world experienced a massive increase in demand for rubber products. The rise of bicycles, electrical equipment, and industrial machinery created new markets that required large amounts of rubber. Prices soared as manufacturers struggled to meet demand. The forests of the Congo Basin contained enormous quantities of wild rubber vines. Unlike plantation rubber grown elsewhere, this rubber had to be harvested directly from vines scattered throughout the jungle. Collecting it required extensive labor. Leopold saw an opportunity for unimaginable wealth. To maximize rubber production, he reorganized the Congo Free State's economy. Vast areas of land were declared the property of the state, which effectively meant Leopold himself. African communities living in these regions were no longer considered owners of their traditional lands. Instead, they were expected to work for the colonial administration. Leopold's officials began establishing a system of quotas. Villages were ordered to deliver specific amounts of rubber and other resources within set time periods. Failure to meet these quotas resulted in punishment. At first, many communities did not understand the demands being placed upon them. Collecting rubber from wild vines was slow, exhausting work. It required long journeys deep into dense forests and hours of careful extraction. Meeting the quotas often meant abandoning farming, fishing, and other essential activities needed for survival. When villages failed to meet their targets, colonial authorities responded with increasing brutality. To enforce their rule, Leopold created a powerful military force known as the Force Publique. This army consisted of European officers commanding African soldiers recruited from various regions. Their mission was to maintain control over the population and ensure that production quotas were met. The Force Publique quickly became the backbone of Leopold's rule in the Congo. Soldiers traveled between villages collecting rubber and ivory. They also punished communities that resisted colonial demands. Fear became a central tool of governance. As the system expanded, the gap between Leopold's public image and the reality of life in the Congo grew wider. While Europeans continued hearing stories about humanitarian progress, millions of Africans were beginning to experience a harsh and oppressive regime. Villages were forced to abandon their normal way of life to satisfy colonial quotas. Families were separated as men spent weeks in the forest collecting rubber. Food shortages became common as agricultural work declined. But the worst was yet to come. Because when quotas were not met, Leopold's officials began introducing punishments that would shock the world. The Congo Free State was about to become one of the most brutal colonial systems in modern history, and the suffering of its people would eventually expose the dark truth behind Leopold's empire. By the early 1890s, the global demand for rubber had exploded. Industries across Europe and North America were rapidly expanding, and rubber had become one of the most valuable commodities in the world. Bicycles were becoming popular, electrical wires needed insulation, and factories required rubber belts and machine parts. For this demand presented an enormous opportunity. The forests of Central Africa, particularly those within thee, were rich with wild rubber vines. Unlike plantation rubber grown in Asia years later, the rubber in the Congo had to be extracted directly from these vines deep in the jungle. Harvesting it was difficult, time-consuming, and exhausting work. But Leopold was determined to turn this natural resource into immense personal wealth. To achieve this, his administration introduced a ruthless economic system. Instead of allowing local communities to trade rubber voluntarily, the colonial government declared most land in the Congo Free State to be state property. Since the state effectively meant Leopold himself, millions of Africans suddenly found that their ancestral lands no longer belonged to them. Villages were ordered to supply fixed quotas of rubber. Colonial agents traveled from community to community, announcing the amount that each village was expected to deliver. These quotas were often unrealistic and impossible to meet. Collecting rubber required long journeys into dense tropical forests. Workers had to locate rubber vines, cut them carefully, and collect the sap that flowed out. The sticky latex would then be allowed to dry on their bodies before being scraped off and formed into rubber balls. The process could take many hours. Sometimes men had to travel for days to find enough vines to fill their baskets. But even after exhausting journeys, the amount collected was often still not enough to satisfy the quotas imposed by colonial authorities. When villages failed to meet their targets, punishment followed. The main force responsible for enforcing Leopold's system was the Force Publique, a colonial army created to maintain order and control production. European officers commanded this force, while many of the soldiers were African recruits taken from distant regions. The Force Publique became one of the most feared institutions in Central Africa. Armed with modern rifles and backed by colonial authority, these soldiers had the power to punish entire communities. Their primary objective was simple: ensure that rubber quotas were met, no matter the cost. To pressure villages into compliance, colonial agents began using hostage-taking as a strategy. Women and children were often captured and held in military posts until the men of the village returned with the required amount of rubber. For families, the situation was terrifying. Men were forced to choose between leaving their loved ones in captivity or venturing deeper into the forest to collect rubber under dangerous conditions. In many cases, weeks passed before enough rubber could be gathered to secure the release of hostages. Some prisoners died in captivity due to hunger, illness, or abuse. But even these harsh tactics did not always produce the results Leopold's administration demanded. So the violence escalated. One of the most shocking practices introduced by the Force Publique involved the use of ammunition accountability. Soldiers were required to justify every bullet they fired during operations. Colonial officials feared that ammunition might be wasted during hunting or personal use, rather than being reserved for enforcing authority. To prove that bullets had been used to kill rebels or enemies, soldiers were ordered to bring back the severed hands of those they had shot. Over time, this horrifying system created terrible incentives. In some cases, soldiers cut off the hands of victims to demonstrate that their ammunition had been used correctly. But reports later revealed that hands were sometimes taken from people who were still alive, including children. Entire villages were terrorized by these brutal punishments. Stories spread across the Congo of soldiers arriving to enforce quotas and leaving behind devastation. The system was designed to create fear so powerful that communities would do anything to avoid punishment. And for Leopold's administration, the strategy worked. Rubber production increased dramatically. Ships filled with rubber left Central Africa and traveled down toward the Atlantic coast. From there, cargo vessels carried the valuable material to European markets where prices remained extremely high. The profits generated by the Congo Free State were enormous. Leopold used this wealth to fund grand construction projects in Belgium. Palaces, monuments, and public buildings were built with money extracted from the Congo's resources. Many Belgians admired these developments, unaware of the suffering that financed them. Meanwhile, in Central Africa, life for many communities had become unbearable. Men were forced to spend most of their time searching for rubber instead of farming or hunting. Food production declined, leading to widespread hunger. Villages were abandoned as people fled deeper into the forests to escape colonial agents. Disease and exhaustion spread among populations already weakened by overwork and malnutrition. Entire regions experienced dramatic population declines. Historians estimate that millions of people died during the decades of Leopold's rule. Death came from many causes: violence, starvation, disease, and collapsing social systems. The Congo Free State had effectively become a giant forced labor camp. Yet despite these atrocities, the outside world knew very little about what was happening inside Leopold's private colony. The region was vast and remote. Travel was difficult, and colonial officials tightly controlled information leaving the territory. Leopold also in propaganda. He funded publications, sponsored conferences, and supported organizations that promoted his image as a humanitarian ruler bringing civilization to Africa. Invested heavily. For many years, this strategy succeeded. European newspapers often praised Leopold's efforts to develop the Congo. Some reports even claimed that he was fighting against the Arab slave trade and improving the lives of African communities. But slowly, cracks began to appear in this carefully constructed story. Missionaries, travelers, and a few courageous witnesses started reporting disturbing accounts from the Congo. Their letters and testimonies described violence, forced labor, and brutal punishments that contradicted the official narrative. At first, these reports were dismissed as exaggerations or misunderstandings. But as more witnesses spoke out, the truth became harder to ignore. A growing number of activists and journalists began investigating the situation in Leopold's colony. What they uncovered would soon shock the world and ignite one of the first major international human rights campaigns in history. The empire Leopold had built in secrecy was about to face global scrutiny, and the horrors of the Congo Free State would finally begin to emerge into the light. The world begins to notice. For years, the horrors unfolding inside the Congo Free State remained largely hidden from the outside world. The region was vast, remote, and tightly controlled by colonial authorities. Information leaving the territory passed through the hands of officials loyal to Leopold II of Belgium. But no system of secrecy lasts forever. By the late 1890s, a small number of missionaries, traders, and travelers began sending troubling reports back to Europe and the United States. Their letters described a colonial regime built on fear, forced labor, and brutal punishment. At first, these accounts received little attention. Many Europeans still believed Leopold's carefully crafted image as a humanitarian king. After all, he had spent years presenting himself as a champion of civilization in Africa. He had funded scientific expeditions, supported missionaries, and claimed to be fighting the Arab slave trade in Central Africa. His organizations continued to speak about progress, development, and the moral responsibility of Europe to uplift the African continent. But the testimonies coming out of the Congo were becoming too detailed and too consistent to ignore. One of the most important early witnesses was a British shipping clerk named Edmund Dene Morel. Morel worked for a shipping company that handled cargo traveling between Europe and Central Africa. At first, his job seemed routine. Ships arrived from the Congo carrying rubber and ivory, and they departed again with manufactured goods and supplies. But as Morel examined the shipping records more closely, something began to trouble him. The ships leaving Europe were not filled with trade goods that would normally be exchanged in a balanced commercial relationship. Instead, they carried large quantities of guns, ammunition, and military equipment. Meanwhile, the ships returning from the Congo were loaded with enormous amounts of rubber and ivory. To Morel, the pattern was clear. If African communities were freely trading rubber and ivory, they would be receiving goods in return: textiles, tools, or other products. But that was not what the shipping records showed. Instead, the only major exports to the Congo were weapons. Morel reached a disturbing conclusion. The rubber and ivory leaving the Congo were not being traded. They were being taken by force. He realized that behind Leopold's human image was a system of exploitation enforced by violence. Determined to expose the truth, Morel left his job and began dedicating his life to investigating the situation. He wrote articles, gave speeches, and published reports that described the brutal realities of Leopold's regime. Morel's work soon attracted the attention of others who had witnessed the atrocities firsthand. One of them was George Washington Williams, who had traveled to the Congo in the early 1890s. During his visit, Williams observed the treatment of local populations and the conditions under which they were forced to work. What he saw deeply shocked him. Villages were being compelled to gather rubber under threat of violence. Soldiers of the Force Publique punished those who resisted or failed to meet quotas. Communities lived in constant fear of raids and reprisals. After returning from Africa, Williams wrote an open letter to King Leopold II. In it, he accused the Congo Free State administration of committing what he called crimes against humanity. This was one of the earliest recorded uses of the phrase. Williams's letter described forced labor, hostage-taking, and violent punishment. He urged the international community to investigate what was happening in the Congo. Although his warnings were initially ignored by many governments, they planted seeds of doubt about Leopold's claims. More evidence continued to emerge. Missionaries stationed throughout the Congo Basin wrote letters describing the suffering of local populations. Some documented the brutal punishments inflicted by the Force Publique. Others described the widespread hunger caused by the rubber quota system. Photographs also began to circulate. One missionary photographer, Alice Seeley Harris, captured images that would later become some of the most powerful evidence of the Congo atrocities. Her photographs showed victims who had suffered mutilations and injuries under the colonial system. These images were shocking to audiences who had previously believed that Leopold's colony was a humanitarian project. As reports and testimonies accumulated, activists began organizing a campaign to bring global attention to the Congo. In 1904, this effort took a major step forward when the British government launched an official investigation. The task of examining the situation was given to a diplomat named Roger Casement to Central Africa and spent months gathering testimony from Casement missionaries, traders, and Congolese witnesses. He interviewed survivors of violence and documented the forced labor system in detail. Traveled. What he discovered confirmed the worst fears of activists. Villages were indeed being forced to meet rubber quotas. Hostages were taken to pressure communities into compliance. Punishments included beatings, executions, and mutilations. Casement compiled his findings into what became known as the Casement Report. When the report was published in 1904, it caused an international sensation. For the first time, a major government investigation had confirmed that Leopold's administration was responsible for widespread abuses in the Congo Free State. Newspapers across Europe and America began reporting on the scandal. Public outrage grew as people learned about the brutality behind Leopold's colonial project. Activists used speeches, pamphlets, and photographs to spread awareness. Campaigners demanded that something be done to stop the suffering in the Congo. This growing movement eventually formed one of the earliest international human rights organizations, the Congo Reform Association. Led by Edmund Morel and supported by Roger Casement and other activists, the organization worked tirelessly to expose the atrocities and pressure governments to act. Public meetings were held across Europe and North America. Writers and politicians began speaking out against Leopold's rule. Even famous authors such as Mark Twain criticized the king's actions. Leopold, however, did not surrender easily. he launched an aggressive campaign to defend his reputation. Newspapers were paid to publish favorable articles. Critics were accused of spreading lies and propaganda. The king also established a commission of inquiry, hoping to control the narrative and limit the damage to his image. But by this point, the truth had already begun spreading beyond his control. The evidence of brutality in the Congo Free State was overwhelming. The international community was starting to realize that Leopold's personal empire had become one of the greatest humanitarian scandals of the era. Pressure on the Belgian king was growing rapidly, and soon the world would demand that his private colony be taken away from him. The fall of Leopold's private empire. By the early 1900s, international pressure against Leopold II of Belgium had reached a level he could no longer easily ignore. What had once been praised as a humanitarian mission was now widely condemned as one of the most brutal colonial regimes in modern history. The revelations from the Roger Casement investigation had shocked audiences across Europe and North America. His detailed report confirmed what missionaries, travelers, and activists had been warning about for years. The system governing the Congo Free State was built on forced labor, violence, and terror. Public opinion began to shift rapidly. Newspapers printed stories describing burned villages, hostage-taking, and mutilations carried out by soldiers of the Force Publique. Photographs taken by missionaries circulated during public lectures, leaving audiences horrified by what they saw. One of the most influential organizations leading the campaign against Leopold was the Congo Reform Association, founded by Edmund Dene Morel. Morel had spent years studying shipping records and gathering testimony from witnesses. Now he used that evidence to mobilize international outrage through speeches, pamphlets, and articles. He argued that the Congo Free State was not a civilizing mission, but a massive system of exploitation. Public meetings were organized across Britain, the United States, and other European countries. At these gatherings, speakers described the suffering of the Congolese people and demanded that governments take action. Prominent writers joined the movement. Among them was Mark Twain, who wrote a powerful satire titled King Leopold's Soliloquy. In it, Twain mocked Leopold's attempts to defend himself and expose the hypocrisy behind his humanitarian claims. The growing international campaign began placing enormous pressure on Belgium. At first, the Belgian government had been reluctant to challenge Leopold. The king had ruled the Congo Free State as his personal possession, separate from the Belgian state. Many officials preferred not to interfere in what was technically his private colony. But as the scandal intensified, Belgium itself began to face criticism from other nations. Foreign governments questioned how such atrocities could continue under the authority of a European monarch. Diplomatic tensions increased, and Belgium's reputation suffered. Inside the country, debates grew louder. Some Belgian politicians began arguing that the situation in the Congo had become an embarrassment for the nation. If nothing was done, Belgium risked being permanently associated with one of the worst colonial abuses of the era. Meanwhile, conditions inside the Congo remained devastating. Communities had been weakened by years of forced labor and violence. Entire regions had experienced dramatic population declines due to disease, starvation, and killings. Social structures had collapsed as men were forced to spend most of their time collecting rubber instead of farming or supporting their families. The international campaign made it impossible for Leopold to continue denying the scale of the crisis. Eventually, a decision had to be made. In 1908, after years of pressure, the Belgian government took a historic step. It forced Leopold to surrender control of the Congo Free State. The territory was no longer the private property of a single king. Instead, it was officially annexed by Belgium, and renamed the Belgian Congo. For Leopold, this marked the end of his personal empire in Central Africa. However, the transfer of power did not come without conditions. Before handing over control, Leopold made sure to protect much of the wealth he had accumulated from Congo resources. He also destroyed many documents related to the administration of the Congo Free State, making it harder for investigators to fully uncover the extent of the crimes committed under his rule. When the Belgian state assumed control, it promised reforms. Officials announced that the worst abuses would be eliminated and that the administration would become more humane. Forced labor systems were gradually reduced, and some improvements were introduced in infrastructure and governance. Yet colonial rule itself continued. The Congo remained under European control, and its vast resources continued to benefit foreign interests far more than local populations. For the Congolese people, the end of Leopold's personal rule did not immediately erase decades of suffering. The scars left by violence, displacement, and exploitation would remain for generations. Historians today estimate that the population of the Congo declined dramatically during Leopold's rule. Although exact numbers remain debated, many scholars believe that millions of people died between the late 19th century and the early 20th century as a result of the brutal system imposed in the Congo Free State. Some estimates place the number as high as 10 million victims. The true toll may never be known with certainty. Records were poorly kept, and many documents were deliberately destroyed. But what is clear is that Leopold's colonial experiment caused one of the greatest humanitarian disasters of the colonial era. Ironically, Leopold himself never faced trial for the atrocities committed under his rule. He died in 1909, just 1 year after the Congo was taken from him. In Belgium, some citizens still remembered him as a king who funded grand buildings and monuments. Yet around the world, many saw him as a symbol of greed and cruelty. Over time, historians would come to recognize the Congo Free State as one of the darkest chapters in the history of colonialism. It also became one of the earliest examples of global activism against human rights abuses. The campaign led by Morel, Casement, missionaries, and journalists showed that international pressure could expose injustice and force powerful leaders to answer for their actions. But even after Leopold's fall, the story of the Congo was far from over. The legacy of exploitation, colonial rule, and political instability would shape the future of Central Africa for decades to come. And the memory of what happened under Leopold's rule would continue to serve as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and greed. Legacy and reflection. The story of the Congo Free State and Leopold II of Belgium is one of the darkest episodes of colonial history. It serves as a stark reminder of the consequences when absolute power, unchecked greed, and technological advantage collide. Even after the Belgian state took control in 1908, the scars of Leopold's regime were deep. Millions of Congolese had died, entire communities were disrupted, and traditional social structures were destroyed. The Congo's population and economic development had been drastically altered, and the effects of this exploitation would echo for generations. The Congo Free State also became a turning point in the history of human rights activism. For the first time, international campaigns successfully pressured a monarch to relinquish control over a colony due to documented atrocities. Activists like Edmund Dene Morel and Roger Casement demonstrated the global awareness, persistent investigation, and moral advocacy could influence the actions of even the most powerful rulers. This chapter of history has shaped the way the world thinks about colonialism, sovereignty, and human rights. It serves as a warning about how exploitation, dehumanization, and unchecked authority can devastate entire populations. But it also reminds us that truth and activism matter, that witnesses who speak out can force accountability, and that international pressure can eventually challenge even the most entrenched systems of abuse. The legacy of Leopold's Congo is complex. On one hand, it left a trail of suffering and destruction. On the other, it helped inspire a global consciousness about human rights that resonates even today. The lessons from this period are not just historical. They continue to influence debates about power, morality, and justice in the modern world. Today, the Congo stands as a sovereign nation, but the memory of the Congo Free State lingers. Museums, scholarly works, and activist campaigns continue to explore this chapter of history, ensuring that the world remembers both the atrocities and the courage of those who work to expose them. Ultimately, the story of Leopold in the Congo is a powerful reminder that humanity must remain vigilant. Power must be checked, exploitation must be resisted, and history must not forget the voices of those who suffered. As the sun sets over the dense forests of the Congo, the echoes of history remain. The story of King Leopold II and the Congo Free State is a chilling reminder of the human cost behind unchecked power and greed. Millions suffered, communities were destroyed, and yet the courage of those who spoke out against injustice proves that truth can never be silenced. This is a chapter of history that the world must never forget. From the heart of Africa to the halls of Europe, the lessons of Leopold's empire resonate today. Exploitation may rise in secrecy, but accountability will always find a way. Thank you for watching this documentary. To explore more untold realities and uncover the stories that history often hides, subscribe to our channel and watch the full series on YouTube. History is not just about the past. It is a mirror to our present and a guide for our future.